When we talk about why women hurt the men who love them, we have to start by acknowledging something very uncomfortable. People don't wound each other in relationships out of malice most of the time. They do it because they are carrying pain that has not been properly recognized, integrated, or healed. And this is especially true in the case of women who may lash out against the very man who is closest to them. That act of hurting is not random, it's not meaningless. It is the eruption of old wounds that have been buried and ignored for far too long. Think about what it means to carry resentment that has never been given a voice. Many women grow up in environments where their needs weren't fully seen, where they learned to suppress anger, or where they had to hide disappointment just to keep the peace. Those experiences don't disappear simply because one enters into a romantic relationship. On the contrary, they lurk beneath the surface, and in intimate partnership, they find the perfect place to emerge.
Why?
Because intimacy brings proximity, and proximity awakens the very patterns we've tried to avoid. The man who loves her becomes the safest target for the storm she's never allowed herself to express anywhere else. It's a tragic irony. The man interprets her outburst as personal rejection. Why would she hurt me when I've given her my devotion, my effort, my love? But from her perspective, this eruption often has very little to do with him as an individual. He becomes the canvas on which her unresolved story is painted. And because he's close, because he loves her, because he cares, he is the one most likely to be caught in the crossfire of her unspoken pain. This is something psychologists understand deeply. Trauma, whether large or small, does not vanish. It embeds itself into the nervous system. It colors perception. It alters the meaning we assign to the present. A man says something simple, perhaps careless, and she hears an echo of abandonment from years ago. A small mistake or oversight becomes amplified into a sign of betrayal because her mind has been shaped by the memory of wounds never healed. And here's the dangerous thing. When pain remains unconscious, it seeks expression through action. That action can take the form of bitterness, harsh words, or even withdrawal of affection. You might think, well, can't she just recognize that and stop doing it? But this is precisely the challenge. To recognize it requires a kind of honesty that is terrifying. It requires looking directly at the source of your suffering and admitting, this hurt I carry is not all his fault. It existed long before him. That's a daunting admission because it means taking responsibility for your own inner chaos instead of projecting it outward. And projection is always easier. It feels safer, in the moment, to place the burden on someone else than to confront the abyss within yourself. Now, the man in this situation is not helpless. But he must understand the terrain he's standing on. If he takes every attack literally, he will collapse under the weight of it, or he will become defensive, and the relationship will spiral into resentment on both sides. Instead, he has to cultivate a kind of strength that is not naive, but is compassionate. He has to see that much of the hurt directed toward him is pain that predates him. And if he can respond not with weakness, but with steadiness, not by retaliating, but by standing firm, then he becomes an agent of transformation, rather than simply another target of her unresolved suffering. And, of course, it's not only women who do this. Men have their own ways of wounding women with unprocessed pain. But in this particular dynamic, when we ask why women hurt the men who love them, the answer so often lies in those invisible wounds, in those quiet resentments that never had a place to be spoken. And so they're spoken at the worst possible moment, in the harshest possible way, to the person least deserving of it. This understanding should not be used as an excuse. It's not to say, well, she's hurt, so she can lash out however she likes.
No.
Responsibility still matters. But it is to say that if you want to navigate love with any degree of wisdom, you must recognize that the pain you receive from your partner is not always truly about you. It is often about the ghosts that haunt them, the battles they've been fighting silently, sometimes since childhood. And the challenge for both men and women is to bring those ghosts into the light, to speak the resentment instead of letting it fester, to name the hurt instead of disguising it as anger, to confront the inner chaos rather than project it outward. Because the alternative is a slow erosion of trust, where love becomes stained with bitterness and intimacy turns into hostility. So when a woman hurts the man who loves her, the deeper truth is often this: she is revealing not his failure, but her own unhealed wound. And the man, if he is wise, will see the wound for what it is, not as an excuse to be mistreated, but as an invitation to stand with her as she confronts it. Because love is not merely about passion or companionship, it is about the mutual willingness to face the darkness in each other without turning away. And here's the thought I'll leave you with: every act of hurt in love contains within it a hidden message. The message is not, "You are worthless," but rather, "I am in pain and I don't know how to show it." If you can see that, if you can hold on to that perspective, then you can transform moments of destruction into opportunities for healing. Because love, at its core, is the decision to face suffering honestly, yours and your partner's, without letting it destroy the bond that brought you together. If you look carefully at why relationships break down, why women end up hurting the men who love them, you'll almost always encounter the weight of unmet expectations. This is one of the most insidious dynamics in human intimacy because it often operates invisibly. Expectations are rarely fully articulated, and yet they are powerful enough to shape the tone of an entire relationship. Think about this. When two people come together, they don't just bring themselves. They bring their histories, their ideals, their cultural conditioning, and, importantly, their unspoken assumptions about what love is supposed to look like. A woman may believe, for instance, that a man who truly loves her should anticipate her needs without her having to voice them. She may carry the idea, often absorbed unconsciously, that the right partner will simply know what she wants, when she wants it, how she wants it. Meanwhile, the man may hold the opposite assumption, that as long as he is working hard, providing stability, and showing up consistently, then his love should be beyond question. Neither perspective is inherently wrong, but when they collide, when those expectations go unspoken, they create a silent battlefield. On this battlefield, disappointment becomes the dominant language. The woman begins to feel neglected, unseen, undervalued. She interprets his inability to read her mind as a lack of devotion, even as evidence that she doesn't really matter to him. The man, in turn, feels unfairly judged. He begins to believe that nothing he does is ever enough, that the bar keeps moving higher no matter how much he gives. And under that pressure, resentment grows quietly on both sides. Psychologically, this dynamic is fascinating because it shows how deeply we crave validation, but how unwilling we often are to risk asking for it directly. To express a need openly is to make yourself vulnerable. It is to admit, "I cannot carry everything on my own. I need you." That admission is frightening because it opens the door to rejection. If you say what you want and your partner doesn't deliver, then you confront the terrifying possibility that they don't value you in the way you hoped. So instead, people avoid the risk. They leave the need unspoken and then punish their partner for not meeting it. And this is where so much unnecessary hurt arises. A woman may lash out at the man she loves not because he is maliciously neglecting her, but because he has failed to satisfy an expectation she never gave him a fair chance to meet. He, on the other hand, may shut down, withdraw, or become defensive because he feels trapped in a double bind. No matter what he does, he loses. This kind of cycle is profoundly destructive because it erodes trust. Trust, at its essence, is the belief that your partner is for you, not against you. But when unmet expectations pile up unspoken, the narrative flips. She starts to think, he doesn't care. He begins to think, she's impossible to please. And once those stories harden, love becomes infected with suspicion and contempt. Now, here's where the philosophical dimension comes in. Love, in its mature form, is not about demanding perfection from the other person. It's about negotiating reality together. To demand that another human being meet your every expectation without ever making those expectations clear is not love, it's tyranny. And tyranny always leads to rebellion. The solution, if you want to call it that, is radical honesty. Not the kind of brutal honesty that is weaponized to hurt, but the kind of vulnerable honesty that lays bare your actual needs. That means saying, "I feel unseen when you don't notice the effort I put in. instead of stewing in silence and then exploding 3 days later. It means saying, I need affection in this particular way, instead of punishing your partner for not offering what you never explained you wanted. This is difficult because it requires courage. It requires admitting that you are dependent on someone else for aspects of your well-being. But without that courage, unmet expectations will quietly strangle the relationship. And let's be clear, expectations themselves are not the problem. In fact, you cannot have love without them. To expect nothing of your partner is not love, it's indifference. The problem is when expectations remain in the shadows, unexamined, unexpressed, and yet fiercely enforced. That's when they become toxic. So, why do women sometimes hurt the men who love them in this way? Because they carry the fantasy that if a man truly loved them, he would simply know. And when he doesn't know, when he inevitably fails at mind reading, as every human being will, they conclude not that their expectation was unrealistic, but that his love must be deficient. That misinterpretation is devastating. And the tragedy is that both partners often want the same thing: to be seen, to be valued, to be loved. But they sabotage themselves by refusing to translate that desire into words. If you want your relationship to withstand the strain of unmet expectations, you must practice the discipline of making the implicit explicit. Speak what you want. Speak what you need. Speak what hurts you. Yes, it's terrifying, but it is far less destructive than allowing silence to harden into resentment. Because resentment, once it takes root, is almost impossible to pull out by the roots. So here's the hard truth. The distance between love and resentment is often measured by the words left unsaid. If you want to stop hurting the person who loves you, you must risk vulnerability. You must be willing to state clearly what you long for, and you must be humble enough to hear that you cannot always have it exactly as you wish. That is not failure. That is reality. And reality, accepted honestly, is far kinder than the tyranny of silent demands. And the final thought is this. Unmet expectations don't just break relationships, they reveal our unwillingness to speak the truth. If you can learn to speak truthfully, even when it costs you, you will not only save your relationship, you will save yourself from the slow death of resentment. If we're going to understand why women sometimes hurt the men who love them, we have to look honestly at the role of power and vulnerability in human relationships. And this is not a trivial matter. It cuts to the very core of intimacy itself. Because love is not simply about attraction or affection. Love is about the willingness to open yourself to another person, to reveal your flaws, to risk rejection, and to trust that you won't be destroyed in the process. And vulnerability, though necessary for love, always carries within it the seed of fear. Think about what happens when you genuinely allow yourself to be loved. To be loved means to acknowledge that someone else matters to you so deeply that they have the power to hurt you. You're handing them a weapon that could wound you in ways no one else can. That is why, for many women and men too, of course, the very experience of being loved is frightening. It feels dangerous. Because it means surrendering a degree of control, admitting that your well-being is now tied to another human being's choices. Now, fear of that depth of dependency can lead to very destructive behavior. Sometimes, in order to avoid the terror of being hurt, a woman will strike first. She might criticize, withdraw, or belittle the man who loves her, not because she despises him, but because she is trying, often unconsciously, to lessen the risk of being abandoned or betrayed. The logic is simple, though tragic. If I create distance now, if I wound him before he can wound me, then maybe I won't have to face the devastation of losing him later. It's a preemptive strike born out of insecurity. This is not about evil. It's about fear. It's about the deeply human impulse to shield oneself from unbearable pain. And we have to remember that love is the most dangerous thing you can do with your life. It's the most meaningful, yes, but it's also the most dangerous. Because in loving someone, you expose yourself to loss, to rejection, to betrayal, and ultimately to grief. There is no love without risk. And many people, when faced with that risk, choose sabotage over surrender. They hurt the very person they love as a way of controlling the uncontrollable. Now, there's also the question of power. In every relationship, whether we like to admit it or not, there is a constant negotiation of power. Who needs who more? Who has the upper hand emotionally? Who is more willing to walk away? These are not just games people play. They are instinctive calculations rooted in our biology and psychology. If a woman senses that she is deeply loved by a man, she might also sense that she holds immense power over him. And sometimes, power corrupts. Sometimes the temptation arises to test that power, to push him, to wound him, to see how much he can endure before he breaks. Not because she consciously wants to destroy him, but because testing power is one way of measuring security. And here's where things get complicated. On the one hand, you cannot have love without vulnerability. On the other, vulnerability creates the possibility of power imbalances that can be exploited. The healthiest relationships are the ones where both partners recognize this tension and consciously refuse to weaponize it. They choose to protect each other's vulnerability rather than exploit it. But when fear takes over, when insecurity, past trauma, or resentment dominate, that choice often disappears, and people resort to striking first, striking hard, in an attempt to shield themselves from the perceived threat of intimacy. It's a paradox, really. The very thing we long for most, deep connection, unconditional love, is also the very thing we are most afraid of. Because to receive it means we are no longer entirely self-contained. Our lives become bound up with another's, and that is terrifying in a world where loss is inevitable. If you love, you will lose. There's no escaping that. One way or another, through separation, betrayal, or even death, love carries loss at its core. And the human psyche, knowing this, sometimes tries to soften the blow by pushing away the very love it craves. So why do women sometimes hurt the men who love them? Because to be fully loved is to stand utterly exposed. And for many, that exposure feels unbearable. It's easier to attack than to admit fear. It's easier to criticize than to confess, I'm terrified of how much I need you. It's easier to withdraw into coldness than to stand in the raw vulnerability of intimacy. And so the defensive impulse wins, and love becomes twisted into a battlefield of small cruelties and silent tests. But this doesn't have to be the end of the story. The way through is courage. The courage to admit fear instead of disguising it as hostility. The courage to say, I am terrified of being hurt, but I will not hurt you to protect myself. That's what real maturity looks like in love. It's not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear dictate your actions. It's the recognition that love is always dangerous, but that the alternative, loneliness, isolation, cynicism, is far more destructive in the long run. So the challenge for both men and women is to stop using power as a weapon and fear as an excuse. To look one another in the eye and say, yes, you could hurt me. You have that power.
But I choose to trust you not to.
And I choose not to hurt you in return. That's the only way intimacy survives. And here's the thought worth carrying with you. Every act of cruelty in love is, at its root, an admission of fear. If you can see the fear beneath the cruelty, if you can name it, then you can decide to meet it not with retaliation, but with courage. Because love, ultimately, is not about being safe. It's about being brave enough to remain vulnerable, even when you know the risk. When we ask why women hurt the men who love them, we can't overlook something so simple, so ordinary, that it almost seems trivial. And yet it is the foundation of all lasting relationships. That something is gratitude. The absence of gratitude is like rot in the beams of a house. It may remain invisible for years, but slowly and surely, it erodes the structure until the whole thing collapses under its own weight. What happens when love is taken for granted? At the beginning of a relationship, there is excitement. Every gesture feels meaningful. A text message, a small gift, a word of kindness, they all carry a kind of magic. But over time, familiarity breeds blindness. The daily sacrifices, the ordinary acts of service, the quiet efforts made in love, these things start to disappear from conscious notice. What was once seen as special becomes expected. And when expectation replaces gratitude, resentment takes root. This is particularly dangerous because human beings are meaning-seeking creatures. We need to know that what we do matters. A man who devotes himself to his partner, whether through work, providing, listening, or simply being present, does so with an unspoken hope that his effort will be recognized, that it will be valued. When it isn't, he doesn't just feel unnoticed. He feels invisible. And invisibility is one of the most painful experiences in human existence. A woman may believe that her silence means neutrality. She may think, he knows I appreciate him. I don't need to say it every day. But silence is not neutral. Silence, in the face of effort, is experienced as indifference. And indifference is corrosive. Over time, the man begins to think, why do I bother? Why do I sacrifice if no one notices? And from that seed of discouragement grows a forest of resentment. Now, this is not one-sided. Men do the same thing. They often stop noticing the invisible labor that women carry, the organization, the nurturing, the emotional management of the home, the subtle attentiveness to details of life that keep things from falling apart. But here, since we're focusing on why women sometimes hurt the men who love them, it's crucial to see that one of the ways hurt is inflicted is through the withdrawal of gratitude. It is through the slow, unconscious replacement of appreciation with criticism. Instead of saying, thank you for what you do, the words become, why don't you ever? Or you should have, and with those subtle shifts, love begins to decay. From a psychological perspective, gratitude is not just a polite gesture. It is an essential nutrient for the soul. Studies consistently show that gratitude regulates negative emotion, fosters resilience, and deepens bonds between people. Without it, relationships wither. And this makes sense because gratitude is the recognition of value. To express gratitude is to say, I see you. I see what you have done, and it matters to me. That acknowledgement nourishes love like water nourishes a plant. The tragedy is that when gratitude is absent, people assume its opposite, that they are unworthy, unseen, unloved. And in that state of despair, they lash out. A woman who feels overburdened and unrecognized may express that pain as criticism or coldness. A man who feels invisible may withdraw his affection or retaliate with anger. And thus, both end up hurting each other, when what they both truly need is recognition. There's a profound philosophical insight here. Gratitude requires humility. To be grateful is to admit dependence, to acknowledge that you are not self-sufficient. And in our modern age, where independence is glorified, where self-sufficiency is treated as the ultimate virtue, gratitude can feel uncomfortable. It feels like admitting weakness. I needed you, and you came through for me. But that is precisely why gratitude is powerful. It transforms weakness into connection. It binds people together in mutual acknowledgement. So, why do women sometimes hurt the men who love them? Because they forget to be grateful. Not deliberately, not maliciously, but through the slow erosion of attention. They stop seeing the sacrifices. They allow familiarity to numb them to the reality that love is always costly, that someone is always carrying weight for them. And when that cost goes unrecognized, love transforms into obligation, and obligation breeds resentment. The antidote is both simple and difficult. Practice gratitude daily. Speak it out loud. Notice the ordinary. Say thank you, not just for the big gestures, but for the small ones. The coffee made in the morning, the steady presence at the end of the day, the willingness to show up again and again, even in the face of flaws and failures. Gratitude doesn't just honor the other person. It transforms you. It shifts your perspective from what is lacking to what is present, from what disappoints to what sustains. And here's something worth remembering. People live up to the appreciation they receive. If you want someone to continue sacrificing for you, acknowledge the sacrifices already made. If you want someone to keep loving you, notice the ways they already do. Because love starves without gratitude, but it thrives when it is nourished by recognition. So when you consider why women sometimes hurt the men who love them, do not underestimate the role of neglecting gratitude. Words left unsaid are not harmless. They create an emptiness that eventually fills with bitterness. And if you want to preserve love, If you want to stop hurting the one who loves you, the simplest, most powerful step you can take is to look them in the eye and say, I see you. I value you. Thank you. Because in the end, gratitude is not just courtesy, it is the lifeblood of love. And without it, even the strongest bond will wither. So here's the final thought. Love dies not in the storms of great conflict, but in the slow silence of unspoken gratitude. If you want your love to endure, don't just feel thankful, speak it. Every day, before it's too late.